Hi, good morning. I'm going to make a start. I'm going to record this and it's going to be transcribed, so I'm going to put it on YouTube when we're finished. Anyone else joins, hopefully any questions and stuff, pop in chat and we'll try and answer them towards the end of the session. So good morning. This is cybersecurity tips for UK-based small businesses. This session is designed around providing actionable, easy things you can do to help protect your business from cybercrime. Without being overly dramatic, I think the tips in this session will help you probably defeat 90% of things that will likely target your business. And we'll see some statistics through the session that will help with that as well. So without further ado, agenda for this session, we're going to touch on why cybersecurity is important and why, as a small business, you're probably underserved in the space and what you probably need to be aware of in terms of the threat and how that can impact you, both from like a personal level and as a business owner. Then obviously I'm going to touch on the practical tips or the best practices for reducing that risk. That's going to be things that you can take away today, implement almost immediately, and see that benchmark for like a cyber attack being raised so much higher than where it might be currently. Then we'll touch around like other things you can do to stay cyber safe with more of a business jaunt. And at the end, we'll have room for questions. So who am I? That's a really good question, isn't it? So I'm Aaron Roberts. I'm the founder of Perspective Intelligence. We are a UK-based cyber intelligence consultancy that specialises in small businesses. And effectively, what we do is we allow small businesses to leverage intelligence, so getting contextualised information to help them better understand cybersecurity and how they can use cybersecurity on a daily basis instead of relying on either generic or not very tailored information. I was the author of the book Cyber Threat Intelligence, the no-nonsense guide for CISOs and security managers. It was published in 2021. I used to work for the UK government, where I specialised in conducting open source intelligence research and analysis across a wide range of subject areas. So I've worked across cybersecurity, counterterrorism, serious and organised crime, and nation-state intelligence operations. And you can find me on social media, usually by the handle @AaronCTI. And I'm the proud owner of Monty the Cyber Corgi, who you can see in the bottom of the slide. So why is cybersecurity important? So data breaches are in the news every week, almost every day, it seems. And that's something that is only rising year on year. And as more businesses rely on the internet, as we are all moving to the cloud for everything that we do, the risk of a data breach and loss of our data is incredibly important and significant. And the UK has 5.5 million small businesses, which is classed as 0 to 49 employees as of October 2023. And then, somewhat strangely, by comparison, only 36,905 medium-sized business, which goes from 50 to 249 employees. And then there's a small percentage of that which will be large companies, companies that are listed on stock markets and things like that. So that small number there, the 5.5 million, makes up 99.9% of registered businesses within the UK. And some research from, I believe, IBM indicated, oh, it was his cost, it was on the slide, telling me. The average cost of recovery from a cyber attack for a small business was £25,700, which could rise up to £3.95 million for a larger business that was the victim of a ransomware attack. So whilst £25,000 sounds like it might be quite a small number, a low number, at the same time, when you're talking in a small business sense, a £25,000 hit to your cash flow, very suddenly, could wipe out your business. It's potentially very catastrophic. And likewise, £3.95 million for a ransomware attack, obviously, for most small business owners, that's game over. So ransomware is obviously the most common thing that you'll see in the news. That's where a cyber criminal group will infiltrate a network. They encrypt all of the files. They will steal all the files. And then effectively they take a double extortion tactic. So they will charge you for unencrypting the files that they've encrypted, and then they will charge you for not releasing the data that they've stolen from you. If they do release that data, then within the UK we have UK GDPR, so the Information Commissioner's Office, we have to get involved, and then the data loss, if it involves personally identifiable information, then that might end up in a GDPR fine as well, which can be up to 4% of turnover or £20 million. So not small numbers, and certainly not insignificant effects from these sorts of attacks. So when we understand how we can prevent and mitigate against the most common methods of entry for a cyber attack, this can help you really reduce your risk from either as a small business or if you're like a solopreneur or self-employed. So the costs themselves are derived from, a number of things, whether you pay a ransom, whether you have to pay somebody to come in and try and put things right and restore systems, replacing broken hardware, obviously improving security as a result after the fact. And obviously the system interruption could potentially involve, invoices not getting paid, services not being supplied, customers being affected. And we're going to touch on this in a second, but a combination of that system interruption and then the hits to a cash flow, that can be really fatal to like smaller businesses in the UK. So you might have seen in the news back in the summer 2023, UK's logistics firm called K&P were the victims of a ransomware attack. And what made this one quite significant is that it was kind of like the first known public case where shortly after the ransomware incident, the business had to close down as a result of what happened. So as a result of this attack, 730 people lost their jobs through compulsory redundancy, and a lot were left without being paid what they were owed. And this was a company that had over 700 employees, a fairly large firm in this broad scope of things, but they weren't able to recover. Another very near miss for a really massive company that might be of interest would be Maersk, who were victims of the NotPetya cyber attack in 2017. NotPetya was slightly different from a ransomware in that it wasn't designed to like hold the data for ransom. Instead, it would go in and just wipe data. And Maersk were really lucky in the fact that they had a data center in Africa that effectively suffered a power cut just as the attack was happening. And effectively they were able to restore systems from that like completely unrelated incident of the power being down in Africa at that moment in time. If that hadn't have happened, they probably would have gone under, and that would have been like a really big news story back in 2017. But I think what's really useful here, and comparing the two companies, although both kind of logistics firms, I think they show like cyber criminals will not like be biased. They will target a small business, they will target a global enterprise if they think they're going to get paid. And whilst larger enterprises tend to get much more significant ransomware demands, when you're a smaller business, a ransom demand for tens, maybe £100,000 is going to be significant, and it might be enough to put your business at risk. And that's why we're going to discuss some of the most measures to help you stay safe. So, I mean, when we talk cyber attacks, and you'll see all the fancy news, and cyber is hard. Cyber is broad, it's complex, there are many nuances. But in terms of a business, when you sit there and say, well, what actually matters to me? For me, I think there's three things really that really stand out. Effectively, you can have information stealing malware particularly if you're a solopreneur. So if you work just solely for yourself and you're using your own device that's not managed in any way. Information stealing malware can come from phishing emails, it can come from pirated software, it can come from downloads from questionable websites, and that can happen from any number of legitimate reasons. And phishing is a very, very common form here. So where you receive an email that indicates there's something in a file that you need to look at, you'll open that file, it will download the malware, and the information stealer malware will act inside a minute. It will take your saved passwords from your web browsers, it will steal cookies from your web browsers, it will collect a lot of information about your machine, and it will sell that on the dark web, and we'll see a slide on that in a minute. Misconfigurations and outdated software. So if you're a small business that doesn't have a sole IT person, or if there's nobody that's really responsible for making sure things are updated and patched or configured correctly, this is where you can get some issues. especially if you buy a piece of software that's doing a job, it's working fine, and there's no way of automatically updating it. So cybercriminals will often exploit vulnerabilities in older software, or we'll see software vulnerabilities come out for current versions of things that happen all the time. But if you don't have somebody available to patch those things or be aware that they're there and that they need fixing, that's where you can have some issues as well. Obviously, ransomware is the big one in this space as well. Touched on ransomware a lot, and we will continue to talk about ransomware. So in order to protect yourself, understanding some of these like initial access vectors is what we call them in cyber. But basically, how do they get in? How do people get into your network? How do they do what they do? And what do they achieve by doing it? So if they can get access to your login information, if they can steal cookie sessions from your browser, that will allow them to log into systems without having to do anything. They would literally use the cookie that your browser has saved to log in as you. And the website that they're interacting with will know no different. Obviously, that can present issues with financial loss, personal information, sensitive data for your business, intellectual property. All sorts of things can be at risk from those sort of attacks. Obviously, the theft of your data as well is going to be significant. So let's see a bit more around like those specific threats. So bring your own device is a big one in this space, and this is a problem for massive enterprises. So it's not just small business owners that have to think about this. But if your organization allows people to use their own devices, whether that's just to check emails, jump on a Teams call, do any sort of work, it presents a larger attack surface that a cybercriminal could utilize because that device is unmanaged. So what do we mean by unmanaged? It's usually where if you have a centrally issued laptop, like your business will have said, right, this is the software that we allow to be installed. It meets all these requirements. We connect to our networks using these protocols, et cetera, et cetera. When a device is unmanaged, you have no visibility of that, and you don't know what else is on that device or what that person uses that device for. So that could introduce a lot of potential risks. And again, those issues around like software updates, downloading things you potentially wouldn't want on your corporate device, that's where those issues come in, because if an information stealer malware is on a personal device and you log into your work systems, you're still compromised, and you wouldn't necessarily know about that, and there's no way to immediately remediate that fact until you become aware that there is an issue. And not only that, you have to understand like the broad range of operating system software versions, the software that's installed, the user awareness of that person using their device, and whether they're like cyber savvy or not. So there's a lot of things that we can really have to deal with and understand. And I think that's where overwhelm can set in. So hopefully by doing the things that we're going to talk about today, we can reduce those risks quite a lot. And likewise, I think if you can't set a baseline or set a minimum standard of understanding across the business, that's where it's hard to defend against a motivated cyber criminal. So what we're trying to do today is sort of raise that baseline and then make it that much harder for cyber criminals to succeed. So this screenshot is from a dark website called Russian Market. So Russian Market is a marketplace that buys and sells credentials online. Hopefully you can see that the price towards the right of the screenshot, it's $10. And these are recent. I took this last week, this screenshot. So these are from devices that were compromised within the previous few days. So it's very cheap to do these things. So if I was looking specifically to buy credentials for a company that I was interested in targeting, I can use this site to search for anybody that has those login credentials, and I can use that as a starting point to then do further things and further analysis about how I might target them. And the one thing about these sort of things as well versus a data breach, where it's slightly different, is because these are from malware, they're persistent on a device. So if you find your password has been used by somebody else and your default response is to then just change the password, that's not going to work because the malware will just steal the new password. So you still have that sort of persistence issue going on. So being able to know when there's a problem, where the problem originates from, and how to try and mitigate that is really, really important. And this is one of the things I think is really misunderstood when we talk about cybersecurity in general. And I think a lot of small businesses will be sort of left to the wayside with stuff like this. So phishing is probably the most effective way cybercriminals break into networks, even in 2024, because it works, especially when we talk more spear phishing. So spear phishing is where attacks are a lot more targeted. So when you send an email to an individual, you're sending it to that individual and you're trying to get them to do something. It's usually one of three things: either open a malicious document, download some malicious software, or get you onto a web page that looks like a genuine login page and getting you to log in to it so they can steal your credentials. So one of the things we need to do is understand what normal email behavior is, and making sure we have measures in place so we have some level of understanding and protection against phishing emails, where we have the ability to report phishing emails internally, and making sure people are aware of when things look weird, they should question it. They shouldn't just comply with what the email says. So this is very common with fraud as well. So a lot of businesses will be targeted by something that's known as business email compromise. So that's effectively where criminals will impersonate a CEO or somebody very high up in a company, and then start to get a member of staff to take an action very urgently because they're in a meeting, quote unquote. And usually it's something really strange, like, I need you to buy me $5,000 worth of gift cards for Amazon. Strange little things like that, but trying to put the urgency and the necessity for that to happen immediately, and trying to just coerce people into doing it and then submitting like an expense claim off the back of that. And I think, we'll touch on AI briefly here because it's going to be important. But with the advent of large language models and things like ChatGPT in the last 18 months, creating and crafting things like this is going to become easier, and it's going to become a bigger scale issue sort of moving forward. And I've been in organizations where, if it wasn't for the criminals' own greed, they probably would have gotten away for quite a long time doing this kind of thing. One example that comes to mind is they'd infiltrated the network, they'd monitored how expense claims were submitted within that organization, and then they started submitting their own expense claims from the email account that they had compromised. And they got paid. Subsequently, they then submitted an expense claim for hundreds of thousands of dollars, which raised alarm bells because it was a very unusual request from that individual. So as soon as it was raised as a question, is this right? Is this correct? That's when alarm bells rang and the incident response process kicked in to try and identify what had happened. But that can happen in organizations of any size. So let's talk about the actual tips and the things you can do to make these better, raise your sort of level of cyber resilience and make your business harder to infiltrate. So the first one here is going to be password managers. Big advent of using password manager, because reusing passwords is something most, if not all of us, do for different things. And I think that's fine in some instances. I will probably use the same password for Netflix that I will use for Disney Plus, because it's just easier for me to remember. But at the same time, when I think about my business related stuff, every one of those passwords is unique because I use a password manager. And if you are reusing a password and that gets compromised in some way, that's a real issue when you subsequently have an attack, because you don't know what else that criminal might have accessed. So the way a password manager usually works is it's an application, usually something that will work in your browser like an extension, but it will store and encrypt all your passwords, and it will help you generate passwords. So every time you register for a site, it will suggest a password for you, and it'll be absolutely nonsense. You won't be able to remember it. It'll be long, it'll be symbols and numbers, and it'll be really complex, but it allows you to then do that for every website you use without ever needing to know what those passwords actually are. And the password manager will effectively give you the opportunity to have a master password, which is the only one you'll need to know. And that can be usually a passphrase is usually quite popular with things like this. So they're quite long and complex, and it's almost like a sentence. So it might be 5, 6, 7, 8 words, but it'll be something that it's easy for you to remember, but it'll be hard for somebody to break. it'll take a long time for somebody to be able to crack that password using like password cracking tools. And if you implement a password manager across your business, then you can be sure that everyone's using like the same thing. You'll know that the passwords are usually going to be pretty secure, and they're easy to remember from the passphrase, so you can get access. And obviously, if you do this at a business level, you'll have the opportunity to then like manage accounts for people. So if they forget their passphrase, you can reset it, things like that. If you're a solopreneur, there are tools, Bitwarden, 1Password, LastPass, KeyPass. Can't remember which of those offer free access, if any anymore. But you can sort of set one up, just play around, and you'll probably find it's quite useful and it's quite intuitive to use as well. But I feel like this goes a really long way to helping reduce the risk from a cyber attack, particularly where there's like a data breach and password reuse. So the second one, and I think this is probably actually the biggest one, if I could put this one in flashing lights, which I probably should have done, I would, it's multi-factor authentication. So what the hell does that mean? So MFA is effectively, it's like a second or third way of verifying who you are. So when you use MFA on an account, you'll put your password in, and then it will suggest, I will send you a code via text message, or you can use an application, or you can use a hardware token like a YubiKey, or maybe a biometric like a face ID or fingerprint. Effectively, just to double check you are who you say you are. Now, whilst there are ways and means criminals can try to get around this, and this is probably why SMS codes are not really recommended. They're better than nothing, but they're not the strongest way of doing this. It makes it so much harder. And I believe research from Microsoft indicated that 99% of cyber attacks could be prevented by the use of multi-factor authentication, which is a significant number. I'm not sure about the veracity of the number, but I know it will be very, very high. So how would we do that? So from a mobile device, I would recommend using like Microsoft Authenticator or Google Authenticator as an app-based thing. And a lot of sites now will prompt you to scan a QR code to set up a multi-factor authentication code. And then when you log in, usually it will give you like a time period. So it might say, remind me in 30 days or 90 days. So it will verify you every so often using the code. Or you can buy a hardware token like a YubiKey, which will just prompt you to touch the key as you log into a site. But if you have a laptop that has facial recognition capabilities, then you can also use those. And genuinely, if you do one thing today, it will be, please set up multi-factor authentication, and that will put you a long way towards being more cyber resilient. So the third tip here is around software updates and just applying them monthly, because every few months there's going to be a bigger event with a cyber vulnerability that is getting exploited, and it's going to be a big deal in the cyber world for weeks and weeks and weeks. One of the easiest ways, as a small business owner who's not on top of this on a day-to-day basis, just every month, apply the updates to your Windows device, your Mac computer, your phone, your App Store apps. Just once a month, update those devices, get the software up to date, and reduce the risk of a relatively new exploit being used in a way that might target your business. And a lot of these vulnerabilities that will happen, they'll start with people scanning the internet and looking for vulnerable systems that they can exploit. So if you can get those patched and get them implemented, then we can go far and away ahead of the rest of the competition. Effectively, what we want to do is make ourselves a harder target for a criminal to look at, so they'll move on to somebody easier. Harsh but fair, I think. So an example of one of these software vulnerabilities was something that was known as Log4Shell. Happened right at the end of 2021, just before Christmas. Very, very mean. But the vulnerability impacted nearly 1,500 different software products at the same time. So you can imagine how many millions of companies were impacted, some more than once, by this. And the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK and the Centre for Infrastructure and Security Agency the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency in the US did a lot of work on trying to find fixes and vulnerable companies, and then doing work to support them to mitigate like the vulnerability. I think it was over 22 million installations that were vulnerable as well. It's really significant, and a lot of businesses would probably be vulnerable to that. And that saw things like ransomware being deployed within a couple of weeks. So whilst those sorts of events are fairly rare, we do often see critical vulnerabilities in software that's really used widely across supply chains as well. SolarWinds is one example that of an attack happened a couple of years ago. That was a really major incident. And Kaseya also had a similar incident with a critical vulnerability that was very widely spread. Tip number 4, you may have done this already, but consider registering for data breach alerts. So data breaches are different from the information stealer malware I talked about earlier. They tend to be historic because the data has been stolen from somewhere, and eventually it makes it into the public domain through criminal forums or Telegram channels, things like that. But one of the things you can do to help yourself is to register for alerts from different services. So Have I Been Pwned is one, it's haveibeenpwned.com, and spycloud.com will allow you to register your own email addresses with their service. And when they find that email address in a data collection, they will alert you, and SpyCloud will tell you what information was included there. Have I Been Pwned will give you a bit more of a general overview. They're both free to sign up. SpyCloud is a commercial company as well, so they have data offerings, but they're quite expensive for small businesses. And they just allow you to take that sort of rapid action to reduce your risk, which is really important when you're reusing passwords, or if you have accounts on sensitive platforms that might bring some sort of reputational or personal embarrassment. And likewise, monitoring these sort of things, one of the things we do at Perspective Intelligence, so please feel free to reach out if you just want to understand this a bit more. I'm happy to have a chat with anyone and sort of let you understand how and why this sort of thing is important. And like I guess like the 5th and final tip really, it's around like being curious and fostering curiosity when it comes to cyber attacks and things like that. Feel free to ask questions of people. If you receive an email from a trusted contact, but it's unusual in what it's saying or what it's asking you to do, like if it's asking you to open a document that has that then prompts you to enable macros, you definitely should never do that until you verify the legitimacy of that, like through a different source, maybe through phoning them, WhatsApp text, anything like that. Understanding when things look a bit strange, or if somebody's like promising the moon when you don't really know them, I would really ask questions, keep in the back of your mind, like not everything is as it appears to be. And these risks do exist, and one of the things that we don't really talk about enough is the compromise within your supply chain. And if it's a supplier of yours that has been compromised, that makes you a potential victim, and that's something you need to be aware of. And supply chain compromises will be used to target other companies higher up the chain, because there's an opportunity there to generate more money. But so those 5 are all very like personal tips. So if you're like a solopreneur, self-employed, you can like go away, you can set those up very easily, or you can also adopt them across an organization, of course. But there are things that you can do as an individual quite easily. So I did want to touch a little bit around like business specific tips and how we can sort of leverage those as well. So if you are a business that allows bring your own device, I would urge you to think about implementing some sort of device management, so you can at least set benchmarks. So I think like Microsoft Intune is one option that you have, where you can say, right, I need like this version of Windows to be running, I need the browsers to be this version, I need antivirus to be installed, I need this, I need this, I need this. It allows you to sort of set like a benchmark policy that that device has to meet before it can connect to your network and access your data. I think it's fairly unintrusive as well. I mean, I'm not a systems engineer by trade, but my understanding is that it's actually fairly like low maintenance from a user standpoint, and it doesn't really impact on their day-to-day, and the business doesn't access personal data. It's effectively setting a benchmark of what needs to be in place in order for the user to access your company's data. Likewise, if you don't really know what your IT estate might look like if you have a lot of like disparate parts and different things going on. You might want to consider looking at attack surface monitoring or leveraging something like attack surface intelligence. So what we mean by that is effectively, for me, attack surface intelligence is looking at your company from the outside with the same point of view that a cyber criminal would, and then understanding how that can be used to target you, what changes you might wish to implement, and subsequently, how can we make you more secure? And that extends to things like social media posts, social media content by employees, digital footprints of, potentially publicly exposed people in your organization. So VIPs, C-suite, people responsible for processing invoices, stuff like that. And likewise, I think monitoring your company's online presence, that's both sort of within your control, so the posts that you put out and the engagement you receive, but also stuff about your company that's outside can also be useful, because we talk a lot about ransomware and things like that, but what about those effects that come outside of that? What if your company is, listed on the FTSE All-Share, for example, or in like the small cap market, what's being said about you on forums? Like, is somebody trying to manipulate the share price? Is it like pump and dump schemes, things like that? Think about those, and the potential risks that they can bring to your organization are probably quite powerful as well, and something that you really need to do from like a top level to understand the risk. So that's something I would really urge businesses to think about and sort of take forward. As a bonus tip, again, this one's very relevant for like small businesses, I think, organizations. The NCSC, National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK, has something they call the 10 steps to cybersecurity. So according to them, only 14% of businesses and 19% of charities in the UK are aware of this. And effectively, it's a 10-step process or list of areas that you should focus on as a baseline to be secure against the majority of cyber attacks, and having like that increased resiliency. It's a really useful sort of baseline. And if you're ever going to consider certifications such as Cyber Essentials or Cyber Essentials Plus for your business, it's something that you can sort of use as that baseline, and know that you'll be in a good place when you go forward to look at those certifications. I'd really recommend that. And this is kind of what it looks like. I think this is like the summary document, but it touches on like the main areas like risk management, engagement and training with staff, asset management, understanding the architecture and configuration of devices, keeping on top of vulnerability management, how you control who and what accesses your data, understanding how your data is protected and where it might be vulnerable, what logging and monitoring you have across your sort of IT estate, your sort of incident response plans and processes, disaster recovery, stuff like that. And then finally, like supply chain security as well, and understand what to do in the event one of your suppliers might be compromised. So implementing tips that we've outlined are really just like a small part of this journey. I think they're a significant step forward. But how do you like continue to sort of stay cyber safe on like an ongoing basis? Because it's a landscape that's forever evolving, and largely feels like a zero-sum activity. Like, it doesn't bring revenue unless you're a cybersecurity company. But for most of us, it's going to be a case of like, this doesn't bring me revenue. This is almost just a cost center. So it's hard for sometimes to get your head around that. But actually, the savings you make from not being targeted are probably going to be significant, even though it's something that you can't really quantify when things don't happen. So, the aims of raising your sort of cyber resiliency are to make yourself a harder target and make a cyber criminal look at somebody easier to exploit, hopefully outside the UK. But, for us, we have to be sort of selfish. Like, we want to raise how hard we are to target so we're not the victim. And as your business grows and matures, you're probably going to find that you're going to employ people that are a bit more responsible for either IT as a whole, or you might bring in security people who will look at how they can sort of mature and grow the business's understanding and resiliency as things sort of grow and develop. So I did knock up a infographic, and what I'll do is I will ping this over to everyone that registered in an email, sort of summarizing what we talked about today as well. it's basically like, I just thought it was a nice little image to sort of remind the core steps that we've talked about and how you can sort of take action from the stuff we've been through today on this session. And finally, I wanted to offer you our free cybersecurity guide for businesses. This one's really aimed at organizations. I think it's quite a long document. I think there's something like 40 recommendations and steps and things you can sort of do and look for to ensure that your cybersecurity baselines are really where they need to be. But I think it's a really good guide as like an introduction to get you sort of moving on cyber and making you much harder to target for a criminal. So feel free to scan the QR code. If you need the link, I can share that as well. Finally, just wanted to ask if there was any questions for our session today. I'll check the chat if there was anything. No messages yet. It's always good. We covered everything. But if you have any questions, or if there's something you don't want to raise publicly but you'd like to ask, feel free to drop me an email, and I'm happy to respond and sort of help you go through anything that you might be suffering. Failing that, I'd like to thank you for your time today, and I will hope to see you on our next webinar, hopefully in the next month or so. Thanks so much.